And that spelling bee thing had a lot of what we're going to be covering here in today's class. And I know you thought this idea of queer theory is rather a queer topic, or yeah, but it's going back to the original definition of the word queer, which the theory in and of itself is to turn language inside out, upside down, and then to transform the world as they have with the language itself. So, so we're going to be going throughout just one topic this week. It's called queer theory and gender theory, but if you get queer theory, you get gender theory, which next week we're probably going to be covering gender theory and feminism in a little bit more depth. Maybe not. I'm thinking about skipping ahead to be able to get to a lot of the practical application that we're going to need to have in our daily walk. Because I think we've been neck deep in theory. And raise your hands here if you want to get to actual, like, Thomas, what can we do out in the world to be able to have conversations with these people? Any hands? Okay. All right, good. So I'm probably just going to skip over everything else. If you get queer theory, you get gender theory, you get feminism, because queer theory is actually born out of feminism. So, all right. That being said, and just get you into what queer theory is. Queer theory is, as I titled, an inversion of the normal. Its idea is to take anything that is normal and invert it using that process, the Hegelian process that we're all familiar with now, the thesis, antithesis, and then the synthesis. So, and that's the dialectical inversion we're going to be talking about. This is the dialectical version in action. This is probably going to be the most pure form of what we're going to be dealing with, that process and all that we're studying here. So, okay. So queer theory is about liberation from the normal, especially when it comes to norms of gender and sexuality. This is because it regards the very existence of categories, and that's the important part, of sex, gender, and sexuality to be oppressive. Now, you get that? The categories themselves are the oppressive part. Queer theory is radically skeptical that these categories are based on any biological reality because it is a direct descendant of postmodernism, which it's what I meant to say there is queer theory is the direct descendant, not the categories or biology. It sees categories as artificial products of how we talk about these issues. Okay, so queer theory presupposes that oppression results from categorization, which arises every time language constructs a sense of what is normal. This presumed oppression originates in producing and maintaining rigid categories of sex, either male or female, gender, masculine and feminine, sexuality, straight or gay, and scripting them, or literally writing them into people. Like the old adage, anybody ever remember, it was big back in the 80s, yo, bro, don't label me here. That was kind of an outgrowth of this. This makes seemingly straightforward concepts seem as oppressive, if not violent. Thus, the main objective of queer theory is to examine, question, and subvert them to break them down. And has anybody heard any talk about how, like say, if we don't affirm transgender people by using their pronouns, that we're literally killing them? It comes from this, the idea of that you strip away their queer identity, and like not like you're stabbing them with a knife, but their whole being, this kind of like weird kind of not biological but quasi-spiritual being. So where are we at? Queer theory acts in ways that explicitly rely on the postmodern knowledge principle, which rejects the possibility that objective knowledge is obtainable, and the postmodern political principle, which understands society to be structured in unjust systems of power that reinforce and perpetuate themselves. Queer theory makes use of these to satisfy its ultimate purpose, which is to identify and make visible the ways in which linguistic existence of these categories creates oppression and how to disrupt them.
So I'm female, does that mean I'm oppressed in their eyes?
If you don't identify as female.
I don't identify.
Yeah, exactly. Like
if
so.
I do identify as female, then I'm okay.
It's an internalized impression. Oh. Yeah, you remember their assumptions are always right. Go ahead. Okay. Yeah. So that was the concept way back in critical theory, where it's the Kafka trap. Either you are, or you are but with conditions.
It rejects the possibility that objective reality
Yep.
facts do not matter.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've been trying to teach this class is we're going to be trying, when we try to approach somebody who follows these ideas, that we're going to be coming in with our reason, our rationality. It doesn't even work with them because they don't operate that. In fact, it actually puts you inside of their little bear trap, which is called this little dialectical inversion. It's like a little cycle you get into where you try to use reason and rationality against you, and all of that is just they build it as a case of you trying to use your Western, cis, white, heterosexual, Christian, male oppression, which is logic, on them. So,
And we have blind faith.
yeah, good point, yeah. Yeah.
And cis means.
Like, yeah. In the old Latin, it means like near, but it means like, it means that which you possess, you know, like what you identify as. It's kind of like, yeah, like cisgender means you're like your gender is tied to your sexuality, which goes against their complete theory, but it means what your gender is matches your biology, even though that would be illogical to them if there's anything as logic. Go ahead, sorry.
Oh no, but that's my thing. Is every time I read, it presupposes that objective truth is wrong. Is that they still presuppose their own objective truth. It's like it's in its own weeds and it's hidden under a bunch of other stuff, but it's still there. That's the statement there are no actual.
In a way, but that's couched in reason and logic. Their concept comes from, you remember the standpoint epistemology we've touched, but it's tied into what's called phenomenology, the idea of the what it is like to be you. Like, I can never have any experiences of how you experience the world, nor Harry, nor can you have of mine.
But that's an objective belief.
Ooh, we have to get real.
Say I can or I can't, like can and cannot.
All right, I'm going to forward you. I don't want to get too much in the weeds. I'm going to have to forward you something of what we call Descartes' idea of base level identity through rationality.
Yeah.
Is this the extreme? His phenomenology? Yeah. What?
It inspired Kant.
Indeed, yeah, it did, and then it also inspired a lot of the German idealists in the 18th century. Yeah, but they do hold a point that the only way we have to transmit the way we can see and perceive the world. And I'm not saying, I'm not going to take the Kantian idea that we have the phenomenal world and the noumenal world, which is the idea of like the matrix, like the way we see the world, and then the world's actually all this digital code. But the idea of that your internal experiences are all that you will ever be privy to in this world. And then the only way you can transmit that to anybody is linguistically. So they take that meaning that, because, okay, and this is the important part, because the linguistic part can be just deconstructed.
Because language is wrong, because it's creating categories.
Okay, now you're starting to see, but once you break that linguistic link between us, and we have the linguistic link of Jesus, the divine logos, and given the objectivity in the world, then you are your own little g gods,
Right.
which we're getting to the end of this presentation, but yeah. Yes?
I just got a question. So is queer theory, is it the same or as someone who says they're non-binary, or is it different?
It's the root of the gender theory.
Okay.
We're going to be, we could, as I said, to try to get into some of the payoff. In fact, I might try to re-gear the gender theory portion into more of like how an engagement part. Because if you get queer theory, you get the gender theory. So, but yeah, we'll be able to answer those questions here really shortly. So where were we at? So yeah, as I said, these ideas are you're going to be thinking they're absolutely crazy, and you're not wrong. So I have to go back to one because I got a transition statement there. Okay, so queer theory makes use of these to satisfy its ultimate purpose, which is identify and make visible the ways in which linguistic existence of these categories creates impression, and how to disrupt them. And in doing so, it exhibits an almost unmodified example of the postmodern themes of the power of language. Language creates categories, enforces them, and scripts people into them. In other words, people get written or grouped into these categories. Queer theory also exemplifies the blurring of boundaries, which states that boundaries are arbitrary, oppressive, and can be erased by blurring them into apparent absurdity. And that's going to be the key thing that leads you into gender theory, mind you, that one little statement. So with its goal of subverting or rejecting anything considered normal and natural in favor of the queer, this can make queer theory frustratingly difficult to understand since it values incoherence, illogic, and unintelligibility. This makes it obscure by design and largely irrelevant except to itself. Yeah. I'm not kidding you. But this is what the world believes these days. I'm not kidding you. Yeah.
So you have to put everybody, I put you in a category.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when we put them in categories, and we put ourselves in categories.
Oh, yeah.
Well, if you were in the original apologetics class, we had our apologetics class dealing with science, like how to counter these ideas. Can science disprove God? And so I gave you all the idea that science is broken down into three main sections, which also match the three main studies of logic. And the main one that they all kind of end up falling back to is what's called induction. And induction is taking characteristics, generalizations, like, so anybody who has long hair, okay, long hair, maybe not long hair, that has, rounded hips, okay, oh, female. I'm trying not to get into any weird things, but that is the base root of inductive logic, categories. A lot of science is just categories. So if you break down those categories, what else do you have left?
A new category.
You have nothing.
Right.
A
And
new category.
The basis of biology.
yeah, taxonomy is a fancy way of saying category. Yep. So, yeah, so you're taxidermist? No, I'm just kidding. It's a totally different thing. Yeah, they're not teddy bears quite. Yeah, my uncle would have looked at me weird if I took home his prized trophies to cuddle with him in bed, but that's neither here nor there. So, okay, back on track. Queer theory has profoundly influenced the development of postmodern theory into its more recent applied forms, particularly in domains like gender studies, trans activism, disability studies, and fat studies. Since queer theorists believe that sex, gender, and sexuality are social constructions, chiefly dependent on the prevailing culture, they are less concerned about material progress than how dominant discourses erect and enforce categories like male and female. Now, when we're starting to hear that dominant discourses, that's postmodernism in play, but queer theory is ruled by the problematization. Get used to that word. That's the queering in action. The problematization of discourses, how things are spoken about. That just means discourses or how things are spoken about. I know I've talked about that in previous classes, so I'm trying to get more definitions here. The deconstruction of categories and a profound skepticism of science. It frequently examines history and points out that categories and discourses that were once accepted as obviously sensible or true in their own time are no longer acceptable today. Yeah, so the problematization of discourses is used to argue that categories that seem so obvious to us now, such as male, female, masculine, feminine, heterosexual, homosexual, are also socially constructed by dominant discourses. And that means just the way people talk about them, the people in control, that H word, hegemony of discourse again. This, to the queer theorist, is reason to believe not only that we will be able to think and speak about and categorize sex, gender, and sexuality differently in the future, but also we may be able to consider such categories largely arbitrary and infinitely variable. So, does anybody remember talk about anytime somebody brings up the idea, hey, if we allow for this, then we end up having this slippery slope where it ends up in this? Like, I know the big discussion was if we were to allow for, say, the legalization of gay marriage, or these opening the doors of these drag queen story hours, that's going to lead towards the legalization of pedophilia. Well, then they paint us out to look like we're just crazy conspiracy theorists. But if you're going back and reading through that, I want to get back to that. So, in such categories, to this, the queer theorist is reason to believe not only that we will be able to think and speak about and categorize sex, gender, and sexuality differently in the future we can consider it differently. So And that's one of the things you want to find out is they're going to paint you out as being a conspiracy theorist for saying you all are trying to normalize, say, pedophilia or pederasty, and then they'll paint you out. And then, but if you're able to frame your question like, well, in the future, if your theory holds that these categories are no longer valid, then that's why we have to learn this theory in order to be able to actually confront the people, because we're going to be coming in with our own lines of argumentation, and it's going to. And you would think it's like some sly, slippery lawyer trick, and it kind of is. It's pure. All these theories are baseline sophistry, and sophistry is that idea of like what a fast talking, silver tongued, cheap suited lawyer would do to be able to win a case just by using fancy talk and actually no legal precedent. And all this is based on the same thing, that their idea that they're coming in with their goal for their objective of how the world ought to be, and then saying anything they got to say in order to get to that point. So, okay, now that naturally segues us from the idea from the theory into activism. And we have this word queer as both a verb and a noun, so you have to be aware of that. So this is where the word queer comes in. Queer refers to anything that falls outside of binaries such as male, female, masculine, feminine, and heterosexual, homosexual, and to a way of challenging the links between sex, gender, and sexuality. For example, it questions expectations that women will be feminine and sexually attracted to men, and it also disputes that one must fall into a category of male or female, masculine or feminine, or any other particular sexuality, or that any of these categories should be considered stable. Yeah. So, yes, Rita?
Is that why, that Sound of Freedom movie that has come out, and I've seen it and I've loved it, I thought it was great.
Yeah, we saw it Sunday.
Yeah, I thought it was awesome. But there has been like political uproar against that movie.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't understand why. And I'm just wondering, because it takes a strong stand against the type of sexuality, trafficking of children. Is that part of what the political uproar against the movie would be? Because it's taking a stand against.
It's not, because it's the idea of the idea of the oppressive Western. I'm going to go through the whole. Just use the term WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. The whole WASP hegemony trying to reassert itself back into society as they've made such headways into normalizing, which that's the idea of queer theory. The term normal is something like, if they get queer theory in the world, right, that's not enough, because if the theory continues working, the snake has to eat its tail, and it continues. So if queer theory becomes the norm, then it has to queer itself. Well, we'll see if it actually works that way. I'm not kidding you. So I would say that's about the closest tie-in, but that I would say would have the relationship between queer theory and the uproar against the Sound of Freedom. But other than that, there's a ton of materials out there about like obviously the sexual malfeasance in Hollywood that had hit the spotlight some back in 2016, Harvey Weinstein and everything like that. So it's not that hard to draw a connection between those two. But other than that, how it just deals with the theory in and of itself, it's going to be just the idea of its main enemy trying to reassert itself. That's it. So, okay, where are we at? Okay, where were we at? Okay, there we go. Slide 12. Like the other postmodern theories, queer theory is a political project, and its aim is to disrupt any expectations that people should fit into a binary position regarding sex or gender, and to undermine any assumptions that sex or gender are related to or claimed as sexuality. Instead, they should defy simple categorization. Oh, and mind you, I think I would like to say that queer theory can be applied to more than just sex and gender. It can be applied to anything, but its main application are those two. Okay, so in general, queer theory's political agenda is to challenge what is called normativity, which is the concept of claiming that some things are more common or regular to the human condition. So you hear me use that term normativity. So there's a definition, the concept claiming that some things are more common or regular to the human condition, thus more normative from a social and thus moral perspective than others. The main goal of queer theorists is to intentionally blend the two meanings of normative which you have the is and ought, the descriptive and the prescriptive. Those are the two definitions. And deliberately make strategic use of the moral understanding of the term to bring about problems with its descriptive meaning. So that's the idea we learned from the very first class with cultural Marxism, was they're leading in with their idea of the way the world ought to be, and then being able to change our whole line of discourse to creating that outcome in reality. So they're flipping around. So we have the idea of a descriptive sense, like that is a table, right? Or the moral, you can have like a moral sense is like this table is good for eating on. And then they'll take that moral sense and then flip that out to everything else in the world that is good at eating on. And then the idea of the table no longer of a thing with a flat top and four legs is the important part, if that makes any sense.
So to recategorize by using a moral statement.
Yes, exactly. That's the normative part that they're going off. Anytime you hear the word normative, norms, morals, you're talking ethics. And that's the descriptive, prescriptive, and that's when you're talking to people, you have the descriptive is the way something is, and a prescriptive is the way something ought to be. Okay. Normativity is considered derogatory by queer theorists and is often preceded by a prefix like hetero, cis, gender and sex match, or thin, not obese. By challenging normativity, queer theory seeks to unite the minority groups who fall outside of normative categories under a single banner, queer. So this takes the whole idea of queer theory is to take all the people that are marginalized that we've gone through and all the different groups we built up through intersectionality. All those people in the intersectional framework are now under the umbrella of queer now. So the project queering, so this is the verb, is understood to be liberating for people who do not fall neatly into sex, gender, and sexuality categories, along with those who wouldn't if they had been socialized into them and weren't constrained by social enforcement. It also produces a de facto coalition of minority, gender, and sexual identities under an appropriately unstable set of acronyms that tend to begin with LGBTQ. Now, Q stands for queer, mind you. So, but you see their assumption is that who we are is only the way we are because we're socialized into them. And we wouldn't be that way if we weren't constrained by social enforcement. So, and that's that cultural Marxism reasserting itself and taking on postmodernism as being its knowledge principle. So, because this is a political project for queer activists, it has become common to hear the word queer used as a verb in recent years. To queer something is to cast doubt upon its stability, to disrupt seemingly fixed categories, and to problematize any binaries within the categories. When scholars speak of queering something, they mean they intend to remove it from the categories we understand now and look at it in new and counterintuitive ways. Queering is about unmaking any sense of the normal in order to liberate people from the expectations that cultural norms carry. According to queer theory, these explicit or implicit expectations generate a cultural and political power called normativity. They view that as evil, constraining and oppressing people who fail to identify with it. This phenomenon may not have anything to do with gender or sexuality and is even expanded to include time and space and queer theory itself. Queer theory is essentially about the belief that categorizing gender and sexuality or anything else legitimizes one discourse, the normative one, as knowledge and uses it to constrain individuals. There's that talk about where they take the ought out of anything that we have. So everything that we know is only used to oppress. All power is used to oppress. And that's where they get that from Foucault that we talked about with the postmodernism. He has the idea, he inverted the old idea of knowledge as power. The power is knowledge. So this makes queer theory notoriously difficult to define, perhaps partly because being comprehensible would be inconsistent with queer theory's radical distrust of language and would violate its ambition to avoid all categorization, including itself. The incoherence of queer theory is an intentional feature, not a bug, because queer theory is thoroughly postmodern, it is radically socially constructivist. So postmodernism has the idea that everything that we know as truth is socially constructed, that there's no truth that we can have that comes outside of our culturization through our culture.
Basically, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
In order to be internally consistent, it has to be constantly changing, and that's difficult to define by words.
Yes.
And categorize by words.
Amorphous. It's like what I told you about in the introductory class. The idea that the queen or whatever, the main character in Lego 2 that ends up trying to marry Batman, that was a characterization of queer theory in a movie form, in a child's movie form, mind you. The idea of the amorphous shape-shifting, constantly changing identities, and then even changing the world around her and her changing of identities. I remember she transformed Batman from Batman into this white character. I don't remember what the symbolism, but if you watch that movie, it's thoroughly queer in its storyline. The sequel to the Lego movie. Have you ever heard of it? They actually made 2 Lego movies. They're very popular. Yeah, yeah. They're hugely popular with kids, but they are the idea of Lego, like the Legos. Yeah. But if you remember the idea about the movie, that you can end up, he was liberated once he was no longer forced to be under his dad's construction, or was it president business, and then was able to become a master builder and start constructing reality to suit his own needs, because that's what all the enlightened people that had separated out from all the normals had started doing. So that those movies are thoroughly postmodern and queer. And yeah, it's funny, once you learn this philosophy, you start seeing it in our culture everywhere, because it's being promoted in TV and movies and the sort. So okay, so back to our presentation. So no quarter can be given to any discourse, even matters of scientific fact, that could be interpreted as promoting or legitimizing biological essentialism, the idea that, you know, our gender and our sex are one and the same, and they're determined by something other, either biology or, for us Christians, is going to be through God's will. As a result, if biology makes an appearance in queer theoretical scholarship, it is usually for one of 2 purposes: to problematize it as merely one way of knowing. This way of knowing would thus be chauvinistic, and that has encoded biases of powerful groups such as straight men who identify as men, or to demonstrate something that no one denies, such that intersex people exist. Intersex people, for us older generation, we grew up with the term hermaphrodite. So that's what that means nowadays. So that because you have this not quite one, not quite the other, that disproves that there's a category. And that is, if you figure that out, you've pretty much figured out their whole line of reasoning. But queer theory's conception of the oppressive roles of science can be largely traced back to Michel Foucault. Foucault studied the production of power knowledge, we talked about earlier, how discourses in the service of power socially construct knowledge. He was particularly concerned with biopower, how the biological sciences normalize the knowledge that the powerful use to maintain their dominance. So in his 4-volume study, I put pictures in these, you're going to see them, and I'm sorry, but you got to see what these people look like. In his 4-volume study, The History of Sexuality, Foucault argues that since the late 17th century, far from suppressing speech about sex, there has been an explosion of talk about sex, both the act and the biological concept. As scientists begin to study and categorize sexuality, Foucault claims they simultaneously constructed it and created the sexual identities and categories that accompany these constructions. So he's basically trying to say, before science, these categories weren't here, so you could be kind of anything. So it was the rich white men in Enlightenment Europe that there would be no such thing as what we know of sexualities or gender without them, and say hello to Michel Foucault. As he would state, the society that emerged in the 19th century, bourgeois, capitalist, or industrial society, call it what you will, did not confront sex with a fundamental refusal of recognition. On the contrary, it put into operation an entire machinery for producing true discourses concerning it. That's a funky way of just basically saying what I stated in the first statement, but that's his actual words. So yeah, if you look at him, yes, he was homosexual. He wrote extensively for the normalizing of pedophilia and pederasty, and wanting to have those laws amended in France, where he was from. So Foucault's view was the discourses produced by this machinery which would gain some legitimacy as truth and then spread throughout all levels of society. This is a process of power, but not one in which religious or secular authorities enforce an ideology on the common people. In Marxist thought, power is like a weight pressing down on the proletariat. Probably didn't read that well, so I'm sorry. For Foucault, power operated more like a grid, running through all layers of society and determining what people held to be true and how they spoke about it. The view from Foucault, thus theories, which I'm saying is all this stuff wrapped together, is that power is a system we're all constantly participating in by how we talk about things and what ideas we're willing to consider normal. And this is the system into which we're socialized. That's why you had asked Evelyn about, like, if you didn't identify as woman, well, then you just internalized it because that was how you were raised. You were raised with the concept that you are a woman because of biologically, your parents were biological essentialists, or, and we're going to get into this later, or you were taught to play a certain role that's called female. So, and if you, what's that?
I played with cars.
Oh, I didn't play with dolls. The car, yeah, because cars are cool. You can't get any cooler than that, especially when you get those Hot Wheels flinging down those. Yeah. Oh yeah.
But I played with dolls.
You were very much like my sister. Yeah, we had a really good time growing up. She was rough and tumble. There we go. So, in Foucault's view, mind you, that actually feeds their theory. If we say, oh, because there's such a thing as tomboys, then yeah. So, just FYI. What's that?
The concept of tomboy is
How so?
just a kid hasn't transitioned.
What's that?
It's just a kid that hasn't transitioned.
Oh yeah, they haven't come out and identified as demisexual or. Yeah, that's one of the things I wanted to bring. There was a video that I wanted. Maybe if we got time at the end of class, I'll show you. But there was a comedian back in the late '90s that he had a funny statement, but a funny bit, but it makes so much sense in hindsight now, looking at it some 25 years later. But if I remember that, I'll bring it up. So, in Foucault's view, the prime culprit for legitimizing knowledge and thus power was science, which held prestige in society for that purpose. Is what Foucault referred to as biopower. Did we read this already? No. Okay. Claiming that scientific discourse set itself up as the supreme authority in matters of hygienic necessity, and in the name of biological and historical urgency, it justified the racisms of the state because it grounded them in truth. Foucault argues that power runs through the whole system of society, perpetuating itself through powerful discourses. He called this the omnipresence of power. So he's trying to state that what these rich white people in Europe did a couple hundred years ago was to put their way of knowing the world as the most dominant, forcing all of the world to view it as normal. But that is not the normal way.
Oh, and they're not doing the same?
Yeah, I know. Kind of hypocritical, wouldn't you say?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So consequently, speech must be closely scrutinized to discover which discourses it perpetuates under the presumption that racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and other latent prejudices must be present in the discourses and thus endemic to the society that produces them. I think we would call that political correctness some 30, 40 years ago. We've got, about 30, 35 years ago is when I first heard it. But now we know it is basically the idea that if we were to speak of anything of that we would have considered normal growing up, that is us presenting ourselves as being what's the word I'm looking for? We're harming marginalized people and being oppressive to the marginalized people, like say at our works. You will run into this. As I said, written up twice at work for using the term ladies. Yeah, and not to a group of ladies, but in talking about third person of a group of ladies. One time about a group of ladies at my church, and answering a question asked, who made this dessert that you're bringing to this potluck at work? And then referencing a group of ladies at my job. I am not kidding you, I did get written up for that.
What should you have said? What term should you prevail?
I was told that we have to use gender neutral terms, so the group of ladies at my work, I had to call them the art department, because that was who they were, what they were grouped under. And then the ladies at my church, I just had to use some sort of like gender, like non-gender term, like people, or yeah. I could not use the term ladies.
Some people at my church, the bakers, some people at my church.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why we're starting to see, I don't know if anybody's been around long enough. We grew up, you're flying, you had a stewardess, right? Are they stewardesses anymore? No, they're flight attendants, because that's gender neutral. We had actors and actresses growing up. They're now all actors, because even the concept of grouping them in, categorizing them as women in their job description is oppressive in the modern era.
Wait person. Wait staff.
Wait, oh yeah.
Staff, wait.
Waiter, waitress, yeah. Or server would be the modern term. So yeah. All right, so yes, I have a little in, you think you see the whole idea, this is all circular reasoning, but okay, so these problematics, which is what they call these ideas, the problematics need to be identified and exposed, whether they manifest in a president's address or in the decade-old adolescent tweet history of a relative nobody. That's the idea of canceling. The widespread slang term woke describes having become aware of and more able to see these problematics. The idea of like, we're getting a more higher resolution definition of woke. The idea of being woke is to be awakened to a critical consciousness through critical theories. And then later through postmodernism, now the idea of become aware of, later through critical race theory and intersectionality, of the way in which people are oppressed, and now a little bit more into queer theory. So from these basic premises, first spelled out in the 1970s, Foucault provided the philosophical foundations for the queer theory of the 1990s, which included a deep suspicion of science as an oppressive exercise of power rather than a knowledge producer, a skepticism of all categories that describe gender and sexuality, a commitment to social constructivism, and an intense focus on language as the means by which power disguises knowledge, infiltrates all levels of society, and establishes what is accepted as normal. So you were asking about how did this happen? Like, how did all these theories get in and around? Well, they're telling you that's how they did it, because they think that the rich white colonists from Europe did the same thing that they're doing now, just a couple hundred years ago. So they're justified in doing it. No. Title this The Fairy Godmothers of Queer Theory. Little history of queer theory. So queer theory evolved from a postmodernist consideration of sex, gender, and sexuality. Its three founding figures are Gail Rubin, Judith Butler, and Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, all of whom drew heavily upon Foucault. Each also vigorously resisted normativity in the three domains to which queer theory devotes the bulk of its attention. These three theorists laid the cornerstones of the core projects of queer theory, which emerged in the mid-1980s. So mind you, as I told you, if you went to college as early as the early 90s, this was already in the schools. You were already brought through this. So this has been around for a long time. It's not to think that this is something that we've only recently seen as it's made the news. So in her 1984 essay, Thinking Sex, Gail Rubin argues that what we consider good sex and bad sex, in moral terms, all quality assurances aside, are socially constructed by various groups and their discourses about sexuality. Drawing on Foucault's concept of the social construction of sexuality beginning in the 19th century, she became deeply skeptical of biological studies of sex and sexuality. Her essay made a foundational contribution to queer theory by rejecting what she saw as sexual essentialism, the idea that sex is a natural force that exists prior to social life and shapes institutions. So the idea when they use the word essentialism is something that exists outside of the social constructivism that they view as central to their ways of knowing. So Rubin asserts that we should believe sex, gender, and sexuality to be social constructs, not because it's necessarily true, but because it is easier to politicize them and demand change if they are social constructs than biological ones. Rubin insists it's crucial to reject biology and fully embrace the idea that sex and sexuality have been constructed in an unjust hierarchy. Okay, and I'm going to show you a picture of Gail Rubin, and this was her, she was a born woman, actually teaching a college class in the 80s. In her groundbreaking book, Gender Trouble, Feminism, and the Subversion of Identity, Butler claims that gender roles are taught and learned, often unwittingly, through socialization, as sets of actions, behaviors, and manners and expectations, and people perform these roles accordingly. Gender for Butler is a set of things that a person does, not something to do with who they are.
And who's that a picture of?
Gail Rubin.
That was Rubin.
Yep. Yeah, she's much older now. It was either that I get a more contemporary picture where you couldn't tell her apart from an old man.
And I'm sure now she doesn't believe that it's a set of things you do.
She does.
She still does?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow.
She's still central. Like she's like the as I said, fairy godmother, the one everybody goes back to. In fact, I was going to put in a lot more material on the other two groups, the other two scholars, but just to keep the class within acceptable time frames, I'm focusing on her because her thoughts are central. So yeah, they are still, they would be considered as, like say if you're a modern reform person like R.C. Sproul, John MacArthur and the sort, or if you're not, like if you're a modern, like say, modern just broad evangelical, you'd be into N.T. Wright or something like that. So for people being around, like, yeah, like these, well, that doesn't even go as far back for us Christians. We hold into, like, we were talking about St. Augustine earlier, you know, so she would be as central as Augustine would be to Christians, because basically Augustine kind of helped shape the idea of Protestantism well before it ever took place. So yeah, she's up there.
I just mean because it's, you know, a woman isn't a biological concept for anyone who identifies as a woman. So that could be someone who is, as we would say, biologically a woman, who doesn't wear makeup and doesn't wear dresses and doesn't wear heels and doesn't do like woman things. But then someone that we would call biologically a man does all of those things and identifies as a woman. And it's less, it becomes like they can do two completely different sets of things. Mm-hmm. And still both identify as a woman. Yeah, like you can be a man that still does manly things, identify as a woman, even though you're not acting out the part, but because it's still socially constructed, they don't have to be tied together. You could still be performing masculine gender things, but still identify as woman because of that's the way they believe. I mean, just the idea that they've unlocked their true. We'll get into the where this all comes from, but yeah. This is we're trying to reason out of something that's inherently circular, so it's going to be difficult. So, okay, I want to get back on track here. We're about a third of the way in, and we still have a ways to go. So, society enforces these actions and associates them with linguistic cues like male and female. So these roles become real through gender performativity. For Butler, because these immense socializing pressures and normativity of gender roles, people can't help but to learn to perform their gender correctly, as though playing out a rehearsed script, and thereby end up perpetuating the social reality called gender. To them, gender isn't an identity, it's a performance. Even though it is an identity, but it's only as you perform it, and because you can change that identity. You can be gender fluid. One day you could be man, one day you'd be woman, one day you could be a little bit of both. Yeah, that's the way they use the word gender fluid.
You use the word fairy, because that was also a term that would be
I know, yeah.
A queer person, fairy.
Yeah. And punk, would you believe or not, punk actually meant the same thing back in the old days too?
Really?
Yeah, but in the African American community, not in the white community, which is kind of funny. So, and that actually isn't by accident that there's a whole branch of music called that, but without getting distracted anymore. So Butler's view is that people are not born knowing themselves to be male or female and thus do not act in accordance with any such innate factors. Instead, they are socialized into these roles from birth by their near ubiquity and the attendant social expectations and instructions, which we know as normativity. These roles do not represent stable or fixed categories, but are merely things people do. It is for her only by taking up these roles and performing them according to those social expectations, which she calls performativity, that people create the oppressive illusion that the roles themselves are real, stable, and inherently meaningful. And the key to understanding queer theory is the notion of discursive construction. This is very important. Remember this, discursive construction. The idea that the way a particular society talks about things legitimizes them, making them seem self-evidently true. Queer theory states that it is through discursive construction that gender roles and expectations are created and perpetuated. Thus, if we recognize gender as a performance, we can also see that it can be performed in ways that do not privilege the masculine and heterosexual. That idea of discursive construction is things only exist because we talk about them. Remember, the discussion is power. Cultures present their ways of oppression, but also their ways of projecting what they know is true only through discourse. And the way to counter it is through discourse. Butler, however, was not optimistic about our ability to disrupt these allegedly hegemonic discourses. Remember, hegemonic means that you've got power over everything. Ways of speaking about things that hold almost invincible power, which there I am, I wrote the definition in, so forgive me. Instead, she believed it is impossible to step outside of the social constructions created by discourses. We can only trouble and disrupt them to make space for those who do not fit. Butler's proposed solution to this intractable, profound problem influenced the activists who followed her in her wake. She advocated for the politics of parity, a subversive and parodic redeployment of power, which we'd otherwise known as clown world. If anybody's heard that term before.
What?
Clown world. You've never heard that?
No.
Oh, wow. Tells me that you're sane and don't spend a lot of time on the interwebs, which is probably better for your sanity and your emotional and spiritual health. But it's the idea of, in fact, it's actually been studied by Christian theologians as the inversion of, we consider the fool or the outcast of society as being raised up to the top. And the modern manifestation of the clown is, anybody? Anybody? Nobody's taking it?
Not get political.
This isn't political. This is, I can actually send you theologians talking about this. Anybody? It's the drag queen.
Oh, clowns are drag queens?
The drag queens are the modern clowns, and the idea of the inversion of the fool into the helm of society. All right. That's in that idea of politics of parody, the idea that they are making fun of everything, in a way, making everything seem like a parody of itself. The idea of what a woman is or a man is. They're parodying it and they're acting out. So, and that's that performativity, but now weird. And this sounds goofy, right? But they actually believe this stuff. I'm not kidding you.
Sound flat earth.
What's that?
This is not very believe in flat earth.
Yeah, at least flat Earth has an internally coherent logic system behind it. This doesn't. So this approach attempts to subvert the patterns of gender performativity by rendering them absurd. To achieve this, Butler advocated deliberately subversive repetition that might call into question the regulatory practice of identity itself. That's the whole drag queen idea, or the gender twisting idea. This often is achieved by the conscious effort to subvert traditional notions of gender identity and gender roles through the employment of a drag queen aesthetic. So that the drag queen is not just merely some, let's say, pervert phenomenon, which it is, but it also is imbued into this long genealogy of disruptive and, what's the word I'm looking for? I mean, once it's in the church, we can definitely call it heretical, but it's something that's completely antithetical to anything that we know as being good. So the little term for that I'd like to call, like, four-letter word. I hate using four-letter words in this class, but just plainly evil. For Butler, then, if anybody get the email I sent for this class? Is the one key scripture in there centered around with who we know as the deceiver, asking, did God really say? And that's what this whole theory is. And we'll get really into that in the second half, which we got to get to quick. Yeah, I'm gonna. Where are we at? 37. Yeah, we can keep on going. So for Butler, then, the very existence of coherent and stable categories like women leads to totalitarian and oppressive discourses.
Totalitarian, oppressive discourse.
Yeah, Handmaid's Tale coming to life here. Though most people would find such conclusion properly ridiculous, her queer theory rests upon resisting and subverting these categories. Underscoring her seriousness, she describes it as kind of a violence of categorization, the scripting of people into a category such as a gender that they feel does not adequately or accurately describe them. For Butler, activism and scholarship must disrupt these discourses to minimize the apparent harms of this violence. Queer theory is one of the most explicitly, okay, now we're into different, I didn't read the header, so sorry. I changed chapters but didn't let you all know. The postmodern principles and themes of queer theory. Queer theory is the one of the most, actually I might skip this just to get ahead. Yeah, I am. We've already covered this. Yeah, we've talked about this so much, so I'm reduplicating myself. I'm going to skip us ahead just because I think we're going to have a lot of talk of this. So do we have an idea of how kooky this queer theory is? Are we getting an idea of what it's like? Because I wanted to get more into our application part, which I think y'all are wanting more, right? But I also want to be able to warn you, this stuff is as I've been saying, this stuff is in the church. And we just saw in the videos that we prefaced the class with. So does anybody want me to go through the postmodern backgrounds of queer theory, or you guys have a rough idea as to what it is and how it, quote unquote, operates?
Well, I'm interested in finding out where it is in the church.
Okay, then that's what we're going to be talking about. Hey, there's actually such a thing as queer theology. The last video that we saw before the class was a queer theologian. So somebody who took this queer theory and is applying it to theology.
Does he call himself?
Yes.
Yeah, in the video, he referred to another person that
Yeah. And that church service we saw beforehand was a queer church.
I can't, it's hard to believe. I'm narrow-minded.
Oh,
Like the whole drag thing, they're so absurd. You know, like I've had waiters or waitresses or whatever, and you kind of look at them and think, that's actually like, but you don't know for sure. But the drag queen, they're not dressed like a woman. They're absurdly dressed, like that clown thing you're talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah,
It's-
absurdism.
yeah. The parody.
Yeah, like really, like very absurd. And that's that whole I don't know.
It's the parody, the idea of like cis normativity. So we're going to take it and we're going to turn it up, amp it up to 11, and then we're going to strut it out there to let you all know that this is exactly how foolish we think you all look by looking as foolish as we can, by realizing this whole idea of these oppressive categories, and we're not going to be beholden to them anymore. We're going to be proud and out that we are not oppressed by these categories anymore.
Like a higher consciousness to be like really absurd.
I'll put myself in a new category.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, by using standard lines of reasoning, yeah, exactly. So, yeah. So you shouldn't even be able to call them drag queens, because that actually puts them, yeah, exactly.
Well, and if you get used to if you're upset about the drag queens, then you'll be more relatable to the people who aren't as queer as a drag queen. Like, who don't strut around like that, who are just.
Oh, if you're upset, then that's you
More
projecting, you're projecting your normativity upon somebody else. That's the whole idea of this unfettered tolerance, which isn't, what we know as tolerance these days isn't tolerance. Tolerance means the idea of like, okay, you exist, and I accept the idea that you exist, but I don't agree with you. I'm going to let you know that I don't agree with you, and I'll probably challenge you in public that I don't agree with you. That's the idea of tolerance. And then we moved into the idea of acceptance. Okay, I accept that you exist. I'm not going to go out and challenge you. I'm just going to let you live life. You do you, I do me. And that was 50 years ago. Now it's acceptance. You exist, and I celebrate you.
Oh,
Yeah, that's what tolerance means these days. It's not the concept that we grew up knowing. Remember, postmodernism, they can change the definitions of words. So I always ask you, whenever you're going to confront anybody in any of these theories, ask for definitions. Typically, the moment you do that, you shut them down. But if they're persistent, they'll keep on going. And it's like kind of trying to grab an eel with your bare hands at that point in time, but it's doable. So, hey, so now we're going to cover queer theology, or as I label here, the liberation of sin. So queer theology is a theological method that has developed out of the philosophical approach of queer theory. Queer theology begins with the assumption that gender variance and queer desire have always been present in human history, including faith traditions and sacred texts such as Jewish scriptures and the Bible. It was then separated into two theologies, gay theology and lesbian theology. Later, the two would merge and expand to become more inclusive of the inclusive term of queer theology. Mind you, they take ideas, the concepts of like David and Jonathan were lovers due to how they were in, like, how close they were. They try to paint and backread modern conceptions of sexuality back into Scripture. So, the definition of queer theology is the term queer can be understood within queer theory as encompassing three meanings: either an umbrella term, a transgressive action, and erasing boundaries. So the umbrella term means the inclusivity portion. The transgressive action means the descriptive part, and the erasing boundaries means the idea of they're going to go out and queer everything, try to break down, and we discussed in the first half of the class, they're trying to blur the boundaries, break down the categories. So the transgressive action they're talking about is the oppression of people categorizing. So sorry about that. I should have defined that. Its use has become more popular in social settings for personal identification and academic settings, leading to the creation of programs such as the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion, a program created in 1996 at the Pacific School of Religion. Building on these three meanings of queer theology can be understood as, and mind you, I took these definitions out of queertheology.com. Theology done by, with, and for LGBTQIA individuals focused on their specific needs as stated by persons identifying within the LGBTQIA plus community. Theology that purposefully opposes the fixity of social and cultural norms regarding gender and sexuality. It seeks to bring equitable value to marginalized voices, experiences, and perspectives that allow theology in queer people. And three, theology that challenges and deconstructs harmful and historically imposed boundaries, particularly with respect to sexual and gender identity. So queer theology is inclusive of individual sexual and gender identity. It allows for the LGBTQ plus community to reclaim what they see as their rightful space in Christianity and the Imago Dei. If anybody wants to know, that means us as the image bearers of God. Just thought it's cooler to have Latin in there, just to sound nerdy there. So furthermore, queer signifies not only a range of variant genders and non-heterosexual sexualities, but a posture of resistance, a questioning attitude, and a set of techniques and approaches. For that reason, queer theology calls for thinking beyond what may be known, disciplined, and controlled, and asks us to re-embrace our queer cognizance, our queer ways of knowing. So they're basically stating that we all have that somewhere inherently in us. And this is the real world definition. Queer theology is an umbrella term used to describe the theology done by the LGBT community. It is done particularly by those who identify as LGBTQ. However, it also includes those who ally themselves with the aims of LGBTQ community. Queer theologians want to do to theology what queer activists have done to the rest of society. That's me cutting through their circular speak. So queer theologians want to queer traditional understandings of not only marriage and gender, but also God and every element of Christian thinking. Queer theology is about turning inside out and upside down classical Christianity, the historical Christian faith established in the creeds and the confessions, by placing LGBTQ plus Christians and their religious experiences at the center of our understanding of the faith. So they're starting with their presuppositions, and they've got to change the world around them and match those presuppositions. So queer theology has a faulty understanding of what Christian theology is and how it works. The queer theologian Marcella Althaus-Reed labels classical Christian theology as heterosexual theology. She believes that heterosexual experiences and thinking have shaped classical Christian theology. This has occurred to such an extent that traditional theologians have theologically closeted God. Thus, she can state, queer theology is the path of God's own liberation.
He needs help. He's being oppressed.
Yeah. Yeah, even those white, cisgender,
We're so
Anglo-Saxon,
powerful
yeah,
that we can oppress God
exactly.
in such a way just by language.
Yeah, so you have that idea of like, this idea goes into like saying all Pauline theology is all misogynistic and oppressive of the marginalized, so we must kick out all Pauline theology out of the Bible, and they honestly do that. And anything that's problematic in the Old Testament, like that's how things were done in those days, but now we are at a more truer and pure ethic now, and then typically as redefined by their concepts of Jesus as being the liberator of the oppressed rather than the savior of sins. So
God is oppressed, and this theology is not liberated.
oh, just you wait till you see how far they go with this. That's only the tip of the heresy there. It gets much, much worse.
We know God.
Yeah. What?
There's something we are God.
You're getting there. You're very much getting there. You guys are picking up these. I thought I was being too subtle with the hints, but y'all are starting to get it. Yeah, that is central.
And we're going to liberate. That's
You're getting there.
No boundaries. Everything is open. I mean, it's all that backward. There's no boundaries.
Nothing that's going to oppress you. Yeah, but yeah, the blurring. Yeah, no boundary. Yeah, blurring away. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. You're really getting it.
There's nothing is wrong.
There is wrong. There is oppressing you by putting you into a category, by me trying to speak my truth over your truth, or objective truth over your truth.
This leads us down the road to pedophilia, bestiality. There are no boundaries.
Yeah.
Except for me saying it's unokay.
Basically, yeah.
Maybe at the end of the class, I have a question.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm hoping that we'll actually answer that before you get there. But I have a feeling I know what that question is. Knowing you, Becca, yeah. All right. So the theological implication of this statement is vast and far-reaching. Queer theology, by claiming that God is closeted, states that until now, God has been unable to faithfully communicate His will and purpose. This paints a picture of a God who is fundamentally weak and ineffective. He required humans to sexually liberate themselves first, so that in turn they could liberate Him. They can come to a higher understanding. They can become known to a hidden knowledge, a hidden gnosis.
Does the term natural?
Yeah, it does, but in a weird way. So, and I actually, on one of the emails, actually had a picture of Hezekiah chopping down an Asherah pole. So those emails I sent out to you, they communicate in picture form and painting form what we're going to be covering in class a lot of the time. So, like, I'm kind of disappointed, like lower lip coming down real bad that y'all aren't looking at the emails. But there's a ton of resources I put into. So if you say I talk too quick, which I do.
It's too much time to read all those resources.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm retired and I don't have time to read.
Oh yeah. Well, I also put in a ton of YouTube stuff. So
Well, I don't
In the
read.
house, I do keep them and go back and
Yeah.
refer back to them.
yeah. All right. Well, I just, in case you're interested, I'm not saying you have to, but it's way too, if you want to dig deeper into this stuff, rather than saying, oh, this is some crazy guy who started coming to our church last year and suddenly starts teaching this class. And yeah, exactly. So burn him, burn him. Yeah. Okay.
Your letter.
Well, if we think he's crazy, never tell a crazy guy we think he's crazy.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I can actually there's the theories. Calls it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Foucault wrote hugely on that. In fact, his concepts of Foucault's writings were, in fact, I think I talked about it last week, were converted into a book and later the movie, The One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So that book is Foucault's theory turned into a movie. Yeah. And if you've seen the movie with Jack Nicholson in it, right? Yeah. So now that he has been liberated, now that God has liberated, they can argue that God's teaching on gender, sexuality, marriage can finally be heard. Gender is not limited to your biological sex, but is a choice each person makes. Your sexuality is fluid to sleep with whomever you want. Marriage is not the property of heterosexual couples, but it is open to all. The key part is that they can argue that God's teaching can finally be heard. In other words, we have to get past this oppressive, culturally constructed ways of knowing to a higher knowledge, God's knowledge, that we've oppressed him through our cultural constructions. And they say we've created a God that's totally separate from who God really is.
Right.
Hmm.
So, in this understanding how important is the Bible, is it a matter of reinterpreting the Bible, or is it a matter of the Bible is just a bunch of categories and we need to burn it and just look into ourselves to find out?
It's more that they'll take you in a way. They will look more into that the Bible was written to a certain cultural context, and that cultural context is no longer valid because of there's no one culture can have a truth that's dominant over another. So our current cultural context is the only thing that can speak to the Bible.
But okay, so it's not completely garbage because you can look underneath and find a hidden clear meaning.
Yeah. Exactly, because that's you putting your current into the Bible. Yeah. So now we're going to go into the Christian critique of queer theory. So we're changing subjects a little bit here. So there's a push within our present culture to accept queer theory and a segment that promotes the homosexual and or transgender lifestyle as holy and God-ordained behavior. Many claim that some people are born homosexual and transgender, but what does the Bible have to say about such claims? Backing up. So queer theory rejects clearly defined male and female traits, opting instead for elasticity in gender and promoting the idea that there's an infinitude of genders. But the Bible teaches there's only two genders, male and female. From the beginning, God's design for humanity was for man and woman to be together in a marriage relationship. In other words, heterosexuality is the only sexuality chosen by God. God created Eve as a helper suitable for Adam. God did not make another man for Adam. He made a woman. This was his design. God is the creator of human beings. All of humanity is his workmanship, and God knitted each of us in our mother's womb. God designed each of us how he wanted to, including the gender he assigned for each of us. Each person has meaning and worth, and God has a good and perfect will for each of us. Those who reject their God-given gender had committed sin against the very God who made them. So queer theory posits that heterosexuality is not normative and should not be seen as such. It is undeniable that the Bible presents heterosexuality as God's design and, in fact, condemns homosexual behavior in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. In the Romans passage, homosexuality is described as degrading, shameful, unnatural, and in error. To imply that God makes a person to be homosexual would be to say that he acts contrary to his word. That's easy to do if you say that we've painted God into being something else than what he actually is. So in rejecting the word of God, queer theory attempts to deconstruct traditional ideas of sexuality and gender, dispensing with the divinely appointed instructions. Advocates of queer theory draft their own instruction manual for sexuality based on their own ideas and preferences. Even if they are not LGBTQ themselves, they are providing cover for those who live in rebellion against God and rejected his design. So the foundation of queer theory is not love or tolerance or acceptance, but the depravity of all human beings. From birth, each of us has a natural bent to do wrong, not right. We are sinful beings enslaved to the lusts of our flesh, and our sin separates us from God. Queer theory seeks to elevate sin to a level of personal holiness and transcendence from oppression. It seeks to achieve the exact opposite of what Jesus' work on the cross accomplished. So God did not make us sinners, rather we inherited sin through Adam. The rejection of traditional biblical sexuality is a sinful life that some... Okay, sorry. I was going, did I write something and I thought I wrote wrong? So sorry. So the rejection of traditional biblical sexuality is a sinful life that some people live for a host of reasons, but it ultimately appeals to the lust of their flesh. The ugly truth about our sin problem is hard to admit, but in admitting that we have a problem, we have taken the first step towards the salvation we need. The salvation is offered freely to us through faith in Jesus Christ. So the idea of like categories breaking down, can you even have sin if you have no categories? So the idea of, did God really say, as in its most ultimate expression here? Sin is deceptive. It is part of who we are in the fallen condition, so much so that it appears right. If our conscience begins to bother us, we naturally begin to justify the sin, often by saying that it makes us feel right, makes us happy, and that everyone else is doing it. When family or friends whom we love openly engage in sin, we are pressured to compromise what we believe. This adds to the social pressure and the drive for quote-unquote tolerance. So queer theory is an ungodly theory in that it portrays sin as acceptable and even laudable as defined in Scripture. The current push to accept queer theory illustrates the words of Proverbs 14:12. There is a way that appears to be right, but in the end leads to death. It may seem right to cast aside the old standards of morality and pursue what feels right, but in the end, God's word will still hold true. So where queer theory ultimately ends in its logic is that we are the creators of our own reality. God placed us into a world that is inherently evil. Thus, our only liberation from this evil material world is to seek out hidden knowledge that will open our eyes to the real world, the spiritual world. The evils of the real world do not contaminate that world. This is where our true identity originates. Only through the revelation of this hidden knowledge, which was hidden from us by the oppression of the world, can we truly be ourselves, little gods that create alongside the divine one. However, our source of theology is not ourselves and our own experiences. It is the infallible and objectively true Word of God. If our sources of theology were ourselves, we would have billions of gods. There's only one God. He's the creator and the source of truth itself. And that's actually the end there. I wanted to get to an early end because I wanted to have a little more discussion, but I'm going to back up to slide 62. If you all get what this says, kind of get where this is going.
That's Gnosticism.
What?
That's Gnosticism, the real world.
Yep.
And our spiritual world.
You got it. Yeah. And the idea, so I'm going to touch base into what we're going to be going into in the following weeks. So core identity of Gnosticism, especially Gnosticism that got imported into Judaism and Christianity, is that Yahweh, our God, he's known as the demiurge, the builder, the artisan, the creator of this world, that he's not the ultimate God. In fact, he's the one who created all the conditions of the evilness in this world. And only through the revelation of the serpent in the garden can we have the knowledge that will set us free from the evil of the demiurge of God, Yahweh.
Same sense.
So then,
Nothing's
if,
changed.
okay, if God, like God himself, like fits into this. He didn't create this. He fits into this inside of us, and he created everything. Then once he was the most powerful, right, and the most knowledgeable, and power is knowledge, right? And so then, did we not do a good thing by, when we wrote the Bible, not we, but, when we wrote the Bible, oppressing him?
Hey, we're talking about
By inverting the power dynamic.
Okay, so we're talking about the queer theorists. Yeah, that's exactly what they think. Yeah.
And then I'm trying to get like the larger picture of how this cycle works in their own mind and how they justify it. So then now, even though we were doing the good thing by oppressing God, since he was the most recently oppressed, now we have to make it where he isn't oppressed. And then
Okay.
he oppressed us.
So you're thinking of, okay, so you're still thinking God as Yahweh, right? So their thinking is another level up, the divine oneness. What?
Is there a name to that?
I'm trying to remember it.
If it's a snake, that's almost Satan.
That's Ouroboros. Yes, that is tied into Satanism. Satanism is a thoroughly, oh, my phone's over there, is a thoroughly Gnostic religion. So yes. And of the second portion, which I'm going to be relating to once you get the idea of this divine oneness, the idea that we are all going to be one point in time through this creation alongside, that we will be united with this higher God, which I'm forgetting the name of, so forgive me. Normally I have to deal with my unfortunate, we have tech that becomes our second brain these days, which actually have the interwebs right here, so when I think of it. So yeah, you're very much on track there. So the idea is, who is this oppressed God? It's not the Yahweh that we know.
Right, I guess by giving him that name, are we continuing to oppress him? I guess in order to liberate him, we have to release him from that name?
The monad. That's what I wanted to say, yeah.
What's the name?
The monad, which is the one, that's all it really means. The I
Okay.
yeah.
M-O-N.
M-O-A-D, the divine one. I did have it in there, but yeah, I just was thinking it's not the monad. Mm-hmm. Yeah, here's like you got the absolute, the ion teleos, which is the age, the purpose of the ages, or the end of the ages. The bythos, or bythos, I want to say normal Greek, buthos, the depth, the proarche, before the beginning, in the beginning, he arche. So a lot of this, a lot of the theology that comes out of John 1 is actually refuting Gnosticism,
Right.
especially Gnosticism as it got imported into the Christian church.
So all of it, demon with monad?
What's it?
Or monad and demon, is there any?
No, well, the interesting thing is the concept we know as demon. The word demon actually comes from the Greek daimonos, which was actually like a spiritual helper, which we get our modern conception of the good angel, bad angel in our modern world, which is, yeah, but that was within, yeah, the old Greek Epicurean Stoic tradition, and within a lot of the Gnostic traditions. So the idea if you look into the Old Testament, you don't hear talk about demons a lot, but you hear it mainly in the Newer Testament, because it's not that the concept wasn't there. It just, we knew now what we were talking about, something a little bit more like, other than like evil spirits or something like that. So you had the idea of this daimonios, which was supposed to be a helper, but to the Greek, but what we know it as, like somebody who's inside you, trying to influence you in some way, trying to deceive you.
But the same with physical.
No, just the divine one. That's not an anagram or anything like that. So, yeah.
So in their timeline, there'll be the monad, and then Yahweh created itself, created himself, and then created the world.
No, Yahweh didn't create himself. He's an emanation of the divine one. And there's no such thing separate. It's also highly pantheistic, meaning that all is God.
I was about to ask, the monad is everything, and everything is the monad?
Yes.
Okay, gotcha. And that's why it can be circular, because if everything actually is circular, then everything is one.
Yeah, it's back to Thales again. Everything's water, too. Which, if you know the old ancient conceptions, that meant everything is chaos. Unformed chaos.
Yeah.
Yeah, true. So here, I wanted to show you that this was a trans comedian back in the late 90s, who had a comedy bit, which I'll tell you, it's hilarious. I watched this back in my pre-save days, but he's telegraphing what their intentions were by making fun of who we were. Yeah, I'm going to find the video really quick and set it up. Okay, there it is. So we wrapped up a little bit early this week. This is great. So how did you all like it? I kind of tried to condense things down a little bit more. Was it more comprehensible this week? What am I doing? Moan.
They're all
I have
screwed
so
up
many
and-
questions.
Oh, you can, Genevieve, you can cut the live stream. Thanks.